to the 31st. Commissioner Peterman.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for welcoming us in Southern California and to the city of Fontana. I really appreciated all the public comment we got this morning. It really speaks to the diversity of issues that are important to you, that we're working on, and it's nice to have that face-to-face time. I'm the assigned commissioner to the CPUC's electric vehicle work and proceedings. And as President Picker noted, I've held this item to be voted on at the earliest May 31st. And I did that because I wanted to take some more time to further hear from parties, given the importance of the proposals before us today. We will be having what's called an all-party meeting, where all the parties will respond to specific questions on May 16th. But in advance of that meeting, I wanted to share with my colleagues, as well as all of you, some of the concerns that I have, some of the questions I have related to the proposed decision, and some of the comments that have been filed. And I also wanted to specifically thank all the public speakers this morning who talked about this issue and really shared with us your experiences with air quality and the need for electrification. I think we're all supportive of that goal. It's just a matter of how we go about deploying those programs. So I ask for a bit of your indulgence as I just speak a little bit about what the proposed decision does and what are some of the key outstanding questions and issues. So the proposed decision approves with modification 4 transportation electrification projects and 1 rate design program proposed by California's 3 largest electric utilities. In total, it authorizes a budget of approximately $589 million, with a further set aside of around $23 million for evaluation of these projects. I can't stress enough that these projects are first in their kind in the nation, and first in their kind in terms of the utilities investing in it. So that's why the evaluation is important, so we can figure out what's working and what to scale. So the PD authorizes 4 programs. First, it authorizes PG&E and Edison to provide the charging infrastructure to support at least 6,500 medium-duty and heavy-duty vehicles across 700 commercial and industrial sites in each of the utilities' territories. Second, it authorizes PG&E to install infrastructure at approximately 52 sites that will support 234 DC fast charging stations. So these are fast charging stations that would be accessible to the public. And finally, it authorizes San Diego Gas and Electric to provide rebates and wraparound services for the installation of level 2 chargers at up to 60,000 single-family homes or small multi-unit dwellings, which is a significant portion of San Diego's residential base. So the Commission has already demonstrated a strong commitment to transportation electrification. We've improved infrastructure investments over $200 million. We have these applications before us, and I expect we'll have further ones to come. In that regard, our focus is on incentivizing as much charging as possible, growing the electric vehicle market, while managing ratepayer costs. So let me turn to some of the issues that the stakeholders have raised. The first is on the level of rebates. For the medium-duty and heavy-duty programs, while the PD provides a full subsidy for the make-ready infrastructure up to the actual charger, and that's about 50% of the cost of the overall charging equipment, it does require the site host to purchase the charger itself, with only one exception. And that exception is that utilities can offer a 20% rebate on the cost of the charger to transit, schools, and buses. We received a lot of comment that buses need a higher rebate and that we should also be offering charger rebates to those who have sites in disadvantaged communities, given the state's priority to reduce pollution in these areas. These are comments that we are considering, and we look forward to further comments at the all-party. Second, we received comment that the budgets for the medium-duty and heavy-duty programs in Southern California should be higher, and program targets should better address forecasted site cost. We heard a couple of the speakers raise concerns regarding what's perceived as halving Edison's program and budget. That's not an accurate portrayal of what the proposed decision does. Edison requested funding to put charging at 950 sites. The funding that the proposed decision authorizes is for 800 sites, but requires a minimum of 700 sites. Edison has said that the budget proposed will only allow them to do 400 sites. And the reason for that is difference of view around what the per site cost should be. Edison's proposed per site cost was significantly higher than similar work that PG&E is planning to do in its service territory. At times, the per site cost estimate that Edison provided was up to 40% more than what PG&E's estimates were. Based on the record in the proceeding, the PD concludes that the cost estimates provided by PG&E are more reasonable, and there's not substantiation for the higher per site cost numbers that Edison provided. It will be helpful to get more information from Edison about why those costs vary. Other ways in which the PD reduces Edison's budget don't affect the total sites that are deployed. For example, Edison asked for a much higher contingency fund in case of cost overruns, a 35% contingency. The PD recommends a 10%. And so those are just some of the examples of why the budget is lower, but the overall goal is very similar to what Edison initially proposed. Again, given the cost variation, we look forward to getting more feedback about if there are better cost numbers, how to approach these issues. Finally, we received comment that the utility's ability to capitalize all of the charging, disallowing the utility's ability to capitalize all the charging infrastructure does not provide significant and substantial enough incentive for the utilities to do this work. And when we talk about capitalizing the costs, this is saying that the utility can put these costs into their rate base and earn a return on it. So in addition to having the expenses of the projects covered, they will earn a profit on putting these projects in their rate base. Looking at all the benefits to the utility from transportation electrification, it's unclear to me why the utility is not incentivized enough with the rate-making treatment that's in the proposed decision. In particular, I want to be clear that the proposed decision already allows 65% of the program budget, up to $390 million, to potentially be capitalized by the utilities. Further utility ownership and more opportunity to earn a profit don't seem to reduce a barrier to commercial customers, to residential customers for buying cars. And so again, I want to understand why giving them more financial incentive reduces the barriers for customers and for the spread of transportation electrification. In addition to the return on the investment that's already been proposed in the proposed decision, there are other benefits to the utilities from transportation electrification, including increased energy sales and fully recoverable programs that allow them to test approaches in these various sectors. With these points in mind, it will be helpful to hear from the utilities, the other parties, regarding why the program benefits afforded are not sufficient. Ultimately, I think those are the main issues, and it really comes down to this trade-off between increasing program cost and being able to make sure that we're deploying as much electric vehicle infrastructure as possible. I will note that the ratepayer advocates in the proceeding advocated for much smaller budgets for these programs, in the tens of millions, as compared to the hundreds of millions that the proposed decision authorizes. A lot of the comments we received get to different points of the PD, but they ultimately are about making the budgets bigger. And when we do that, those costs go to ratepayers, and that can increase the cost of electricity. So my motivation here is very simple and very transparent, which is we want to grow this market. We want to have the utilities invest. But ratepayer money is precious. And so we really need to be careful about over-incentivizing something if we don't have to. The proposed decision proposed a budget that is in line with the record to date. But again, this is a new space. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so it is important for us to hear from everyone about where they think the decision got it wrong, and what they would recommend we do next. And so again, I hope that overall goal to grow the market, to focus on this as a transportation solution and not a utility business model solution, is also the goal and the intent of the utilities. So with that, I'll save further comments for when we vote on this item, and I turn to my fellow commissioners if they want to offer any other comments or observations.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I too wanted to thank all of the folks from the community who are still here and those that came before you on this issue. And it was very important to be here today, given the environment that we are here today in. I was reflecting with a colleague, and I know my colleagues are a little tired of hearing about this, but I just got back from a trip from China. And the air in Beijing is just about the same as the air here today. It is really quite impactful being here and not being able to see the mountains. And I do think that Commissioner Peterman has, in a large part, found a really good balance of how we really start to transition our heavy-duty infrastructure and medium-duty infrastructure to try to get to a better, cleaner air here, in particular in the Inland Empire. I think that we can make it better, and we really invite all of you to come and participate in this all-party meeting, and we can give you information about how to do that outside, because it is important to find that balance. As many of you know, particularly given the demographics in this community, paying your electricity bill is also a hard thing. And having that in mind is always helpful because many of your perspectives are balanced. I also wanted to just give a little reflection. Somebody mentioned the South Coast Air District rules that are beginning, and I do see that as an opportunity, particularly in the warehousing sector in the Southern California Edison territory and in the PG&E territory, although they're not subject to South Coast, obviously. But in looking at opportunities to really maximize where there is synergy there and where certain companies and jurisdictions will have an opportunity to go a little further. And I think that's what we're going to be looking at the all-party is looking at greater investments in this territory and in the PG&E territory. And certainly what I heard, one party that was really impactful in their testimony to date to me has been the CCAEJ, that's really pointed out that the communities of Colton, San Bernardino, and Barstow, where the warehouse workers are being the most impacted by the on-site pollution. And that is, in my perspective, the biggest opportunity. On some of the specifics that Commissioner Peterman mentioned, I will say that one issue that I hope we can examine in the all-party is the time of which we make the decision between the utility and the business on whether or not ownership will be the utilities or the businesses. And I think we should think through perhaps a more linear approach to that, for lack of a better word, but really hearing people's comments on how to do that better without changing the ownership model of the utility altogether. I also, on the SDG&E proposal, which has been less discussed today because it is largely residential. Just on a personal level, I actually own a charger as well. It was something that my utility provided as a rebate program, but it was provided with a lot of framework. The contractors were pre-selected. The workforce that was applying that had certain criteria to be met. And I think that's something we'll talk about again in the next issue, but it's an important issue that we keep in mind when we are not retaining this infrastructure, even chargers within the utility. We're losing more of the workforce that is, maybe not losing, but foregoing an opportunity of a workforce that is well paid. And so I'm not necessarily going to call the charging companies part of the gig economy, but there is a lot of gig economy there. It's a lot of independent contractor work, and we just have to be mindful of that when we're kind of setting up these structures and these incentives. So I look forward to continuing to work on that. And like I said, I got my charger through a rebate program, so it can work. We just need to have that framework. So overall, I want to thank the work of Commissioner Peterman and all of the staff on this and really encourage you to participate in this next level of work over the next few weeks. Thank you.
I also want to thank Commissioner Peterman for her careful leadership on this issue. As she highlighted, the entire country is watching what we're doing and learning from it, so we want to try to make sure that we get this right. I am happy to have the opportunity to talk about this issue in this community. Several months ago, I was able to take a tour of the logistics industry and some of the impacts. I had the opportunity to meet Yasi, who spoke earlier. And I think the overall goal of electrifying the light and heavy duty vehicles is it's an incredibly critical goal, and I'm so excited that Commissioner Peterman has taken the leadership. ALJ's Cook and Goldberg have looked very carefully at all of these issues in the record. So I'm very supportive of moving forward with this program, but also getting it right. So I'm looking forward to the all-party. Some of the issues, in addition to the ones raised by my fellow commissioners, I'd like to hear some more party comment on the DC fast charger proposals that right now call for 50 kV make ready, and I'm interested in whether or not that's the right size, or should we be upsizing them so we don't have to go back as the vehicles change and provide more service to those areas. I'm also interested to hear a little bit more about SDG&E's grid integration rate. I know there's some kind of concerns about what we have in terms of learnings on what they've done so far, but I think it's very promising, and I'd like to hear a little more discussion about that topic. So I'm looking forward to the all-party and looking forward to considering the decision as it comes before us later this month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Peterman, for your very thoughtful remarks today and for such a thoughtful decision. It's very important that we're so close to a very significant decision on transportation electrification, which is a central part of our efforts to deal with climate change and also to meet our Clean Air Act goals. I also want to thank the members of the community who came and talked to us. A couple of us have been here for 3 days, and we've seen through the entire period the air quality issues that you deal with all the time. I unfortunately will not be able to attend the all-party meeting. My advisors will be there, and I will get briefed on what happens. I wanted to highlight the 3 issues that I'm particularly interested in. Commissioner Peterman mentioned those already. One is the size of the budget for Edison. I'm not interested in, I agree with Commissioner Peterman and the approach of the PD that the estimates for individual charging infrastructure by Edison are probably too high, so I'm not interested in increasing the amount of money spent on individual chargers, but I'm interested in hearing from parties and thinking more about whether or not we should just increase the number of facilities and vehicles in the heavy-duty and medium-duty freight sector that we're incentivizing through this program. The air quality here is very bad. We need programs to address it. The goods movement corridors go through disadvantaged communities, and these programs can target vehicles traveling those corridors. And so that's one issue that I'm particularly interested in. A second one is the size of the incentives for charging or for chargers, the rebates provided. The decision authorizes 20% for schools and transit buses. I'm interested in thinking about whether or not that should be a higher level, especially for the buses, given that we are at an inflection point for buses. The cost of those vehicles have dropped dramatically. We could make some dramatic gains in shifting over the fleet if we have adequate infrastructure. Higher subsidies may be appropriate to spur that transition. I'm also interested in whether or not some additional incentives for facilities in disadvantaged communities for purchasing the charger are appropriate for similar reasons. And then finally, on the question of the San Diego application, I agree with Commissioner Peterman that and the decision that it's not appropriate to have the utilities fully capitalize the costs of infrastructure for residential chargers. Having said that, I'm open to thinking about whether or not there may be other incentives that could spur investment in that area, particularly in disadvantaged communities. So we'll be looking for suggestions and thoughts from the parties on that. Thank you.
I have some broad concerns in terms of the overall design of our approach, and they really kind of center around questions of access and utilization. So I tend to lean towards fleet and transit investments, because we know that the charging infrastructure will be more effectively used. If you have a corporation yard, if you have a large industrial or commercial facility where you're doing goods movement, the chances are that the investment in the infrastructure and the overall reduction of emissions is going to be much greater than, for example, a individual owner. I also have concerns about access, in that I also am an EV lessor. I don't own it, but I lease it. And I have a level 2 charger. It's locked up in my garage 168 hours a week. It gets used max 8 hours a week. What kind of a utility, what kind of a good investment does that represent? So frankly, I would prefer to see more public charging, and particularly workplace charging, because that actually is going to take place during the day when we have lots of excess solar, which I talked about before. So I struggle with this framework that we are still approaching some large portion of this program as around individual homeowner or renters. I feel like those are going to be stranded at some point in the future. So I have this ongoing anxiety. It may be what the legislature, it may be what a lot of consumers currently desire, but if our job is efficiency and the maximum reduction of pollution and carbon, I think that we'd be better looking at transit and fleet sites, and then thinking about how we give more public access to charging.
Thank you all for your comments. They were helpful and instructive, and I think they really highlight the diversity of directions we could go in this space, as well as just the wide need. I just want to offer a couple of follow-up comments. First, I appreciate President Picker's point about going and installing charging where there are even more market barriers, like multi-unit dwellings, workplaces. And I'll acknowledge that the first set of pilots that we approved, the $200 million, was for workplace and MUD. And so these applications are focused on different sectors, but I do expect once we get the results from those first phases, the utilities will file future applications to expand or serve those market needs. There is this tension about medium heavy-duty funding versus light-duty vehicle. We know that from a pollution perspective, we really need to transform medium heavy duty, but those are also the most expensive types of infrastructure to invest in. So, I have not run the numbers, but on a per kind of dollar basis, it might be more expensive still to get emissions reduction in those sectors versus home charging. We also know that we still need to have individuals, drive electric vehicles, and the cost of those chargers are less. And so we might be able to put less money to that market, but satisfy those needs more. And that is some of the balance here. All of these things we're talking about as pilots and programs because we don't really know what people will want to use in the end. But that is the tension that we face, that these assets have to be used and useful, especially if you put them into rate base. And so that makes that higher standard of review for putting them in that category. On the point about other incentives for the utility besides rate base, this is a question we thought about before. And when we first issued direction to the utilities in 2015 to look at proposing programs, we specifically asked them to recommend performance-based incentives, alternatives to traditional rate-making treatment that might incentivize their participation in these programs. None of those proposals have been submitted to date. But again, we're all learning. And so if the utilities think that there is some value in something like that, we can talk about how we move there in the future. And then I want to comment that Commissioner Rexhoffen, I think, highlighted a distinction about the two separate issues related to Edison's program. So there's whether the program overall should be bigger and what the appropriate budget size is for a certain program. And we'll be looking at talking about both of those issues in the all-party. And then finally, my colleagues have raised really helpful, specific questions of what they're trying to get out of the all-party. I will note, I think the agenda has gone out with the questions, or it hasn't. Good, I'm getting the note that it hasn't, not that it hasn't. So we'll incorporate these. We have a lot to cover, and so I appreciate everyone coming prepared and ready to make your comments. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for your thoughtful work here. Thank you to all the parties, the judges. We've had over 50 parties who participate in this proceeding, so a lot of interest, and I look forward to bringing this item back to you May 31st. Thank you.